There is a city in the Sahara where people can point to the exact spot where their childhood home used to be, except now there is nothing to point at but a dune. The sand does not knock, it does not warn. It simply arrives, grain by grain, year by year, until a rooftop becomes a floor, and a floor becomes a memory. In a town called Chenetti, in the heart of Mauritania, residents will tell you the desert is not an enemy. It is their destiny. And somehow, in a nation where nearly the entire landscape is Sahara, where a whole city can be quietly swallowed by sand while its libraries still hold manuscripts older than most modern countries, millions of people are not surviving here. They are living fully, deliberately, and on their own terms. This is a place most of the world cannot find on a map, wedged between Morocco's western edge and the green banks of Senegal, facing an Atlantic coastline that few tourists ever see. It is a country that is almost entirely desert, and yet it is also a country built on hospitality so precise it has its own ritual, its own rhythm, its own quiet philosophy about what life owes you and what you owe it back. Before we go further, if the idea of a nation where cities lose to sand and time still moves at the pace of a poured cup of tea sounds like somewhere you'd want to understand more deeply, this channel exists exactly for places like this. Subscribe if you want more of the world's most overlooked corners explained properly, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Because right now, somewhere in Mauritania, someone is doing the exact same thing you're about to do for the next half hour. They're sitting still, and they're letting the desert do the talking. To understand Mauritania, you first have to accept a number that sounds almost impossible. This is a country roughly the size of Egypt and France combined, and nearly all of it is desert. Flat gravel plains stretch for hundreds of kilometers before breaking into towering dune fields, and in the center of the country, rocky plateaus rise abruptly out of nothing, like the land forgot to finish itself. Geographers consider Mauritania one of the emptiest countries on Earth, and the emptiness is not a metaphor. Outside of the capital and a scattering of towns along the coast and the southern river valley, you can drive for hours and see no one. The northern and eastern reaches of the country are so severe that establishing any real settlement there is close to impossible. And yet, within that vastness sits one of the strangest and most beautiful geological features on the planet. A colossal, near-perfect ring of rock nearly 50 kilometers across, visible from space, so symmetrical that early astronauts mistook it for an impact crater. Locals call it the Eye of the Sahara. Scientists still debate exactly how it formed. For a country defined by flatness, it is the one place where the land rises up and stares back at you. Mauritania straddles two worlds at once. To the north, it belongs to the Maghreb, the Arab-influenced band of North Africa that also includes Morocco and Algeria. To the south, it dips into the Sahel, the semi-arid belt where the desert begins its long, slow negotiation with sub-Saharan Africa. This isn't just a geographic curiosity, it shapes everything, from the language people speak to the food on their plates to the music drifting out of a taxi window. The country is bordered by Western Sahara, Algeria, Mali, and Senegal, and its western edge runs along more than 400 miles of Atlantic coastline, a coast so rich in marine life that its waters are considered among the most productive fishing grounds anywhere on the planet. It is a strange, almost cinematic contrast. Turn east and you face thousands of kilometers of some of the driest land on the planet. Turn west, and the ocean is right there, cold, foggy, and teeming with fish. Because so much of the interior is uninhabitable, the human geography of Mauritania is lopsided in a way few countries can match. Roughly two-thirds of the population lives clustered in the milder southern strip near the Senegal River, where there's enough water for farming, or along the coast, where the capital, Nouakchott, has grown from a small desert outpost into a sprawling city of well over 1 million people. Nouakchott didn't exist as a real city before Mauritania's independence in 1960. It was built, quite literally, from a village into a capital, and today it holds close to a fifth of the entire country's population, growing constantly as families leave the harshening desert behind. Further north, along the coast, sits Nouadhibou, the country's second city and its economic engine, a place of fish processing plants, container ships, and one of the longest and most surreal freight trains in the world, hauling iron ore hundreds of kilometers from mines in the interior straight to the Atlantic. The highest point in the entire country, a peak called Kadiet Ajajil near Zouera, rises to only around 900 meters, a reminder of just how flat and low-lying this landscape really is despite its vastness. Zouerat itself exists almost entirely because of iron ore, and from the mines nearby, one of the longest freight trains on Earth departs regularly, sometimes stretching beyond 2 kilometers in length, hauling raw ore across empty desert to the port at Nouadhibou. For a certain kind of traveler, riding that train, sitting on top of open ore cars under the stars for 18 hours, has become one of the most talked about journeys in West Africa. A strange, gritty pilgrimage through a landscape that offers no shade and no mercy, only distance. The climate does not soften any of this. Mauritania sits under a relentless sun for most of the year, and the harmattan, a dry, dust-thick wind that rolls down from the Sahara, defines much of daily life during the long, dry season. Rain is scarce and irregular, and the far north barely sees it at all. But climate here is not simply hot, it is theatrical. Skies turn the color of rust during major dust events. Nights in the desert interior can be startlingly cold, a contrast that surprises almost every visitor who expects endless heat and instead finds themselves reaching for a blanket after sunset. And light, in Mauritania, has its own personality. At dawn and dusk, the dunes take on a deep gold, almost pink, that photographers travel across continents to capture. And against that light, the silhouettes of camels and acacia trees look less like a country and more like a memory of one. And then there is Chenetti itself, the place that gives this story its shape. Founded in the 13th century as a hub along the trans-Saharan trade and pilgrimage routes, it became known as one of Islam's holiest cities, a place scholars traveled toward for centuries, drawn by its libraries. Those libraries still stand. Private family collections holding thousands of manuscripts on law, mathematics, astronomy, and theology, some of them among the oldest documents in West Africa. In 1996, UNESCO designated Chenetti, along with 3 other historic desert towns, as a World Heritage Site, an acknowledgement of a past almost too rich to be housed in a place with so few residents left to guard it. Because that is the paradox. The 8th century core of the old town is already buried beneath the dunes. Newer neighborhoods are losing the fight too, sand piling into courtyards, filling doorways, submerging entire rooms while families still live next door. Community leaders describe watching the sand advance in real time, like witnessing a disaster unfold in extremely slow motion. Tree planting projects have been introduced to try to hold the dunes back, belts of vegetation meant to anchor the sand before it reaches the old mosque, with its square ancient minaret capped in ostrich eggs. So far, they are buying time, not winning, and residents know it. They stay anyway. None of this happened in a historical vacuum. Long before there was a country called Mauritania, this stretch of the Sahara sat at the heart of one of Africa's great trading civilizations. As early as the 9th century, the ancient empire of Ghana, unrelated to the modern nation that later borrowed its name, grew wealthy here by controlling the flow of gold moving north and salt moving south, its capital drawing Arab merchants across the desert in search of what they called simply the Golden Country. In the 11th century, a puritanical religious movement rose among the nomadic Sanhaja Berber tribes of this region known as the Almoravids. Beginning as little more than a fortified religious retreat, the movement swept outward with startling speed, founding the city of Marrakesh, crossing into Spain, and eventually controlling territory stretching from West Africa to the Iberian Peninsula, a Saharan empire that briefly reshaped the map of two continents. In the centuries that followed, towns like Chenetti, Wadain, Tichit, and Walata rose along these same caravan routes as centers of Islamic scholarship, drawing pilgrims and scholars from across West Africa on their way toward Mecca. That deep intellectual heritage is exactly why Chenetti's libraries matter so much today, and exactly why losing them to the dunes feels to the people trying to stop it like losing a piece of world history that can never be rebuilt. If you want to understand how people actually live inside all of this, you cannot start with buildings. You have to start with a small glass of tea. In Mauritania, tea is not a beverage. It's closer to a national language. A ritual so precise it has its own vocabulary and its own unspoken laws. It's called a tai, and it happens everywhere, in Nouakchot's wealthier neighborhoods and in the poorest peri-urban districts alike, in homes, in market stalls, under the open desert sky at the edge of a camp. Whoever hosts prepares it themselves, brewing strong green tea over hot coals or a small gas burner, pouring it from a height between two small glasses again and again until a thick foam rises on top, a sign of skill as much as flavor. It is then served in 3 rounds, and each round is not optional. To refuse a glass of tea in Mauritania is considered genuinely impolite. The first glass is poured strong and nearly bitter, and it's said to represent life as it actually is. The second, sweeter, is said to represent love. The third, sweetest of all, is said to represent death, gentle and inevitable. 3 small glasses, 3 truths about being alive, handed to you by someone who wants nothing from you except your company for the next hour. Tea can be served 3 or 4 times a day in an ordinary household, and during gatherings it sometimes flows almost continuously from morning until the last guest leaves at night. Even during hard economic years, this ritual barely changes pace, because it was never really about the tea. Homes in Mauritania reflect the same tension you find everywhere else in the country, between an ancient nomadic past and a rapidly urbanizing present. For centuries, most Mauritanians lived as pastoral nomads, moving with herds of goats, sheep, and camels across the Sahara and the Sahel, following whatever grazing the season allowed. Their homes were tents, khaimas, woven from wool and cloth, easy to raise and easy to fold away, designed for a life that never stayed anywhere long enough to need walls. Severe droughts beginning in the 1970s pushed huge numbers of nomadic families towards cities, a shift that reshaped the entire country within a single generation. But the old life didn't vanish, it just moved closer to the new one. In Nouakchott today, and in smaller towns across the interior, it's common to find a khaima pitched right beside a concrete house, not as a relic, but as a functioning part of the household, a place where the family still gathers, still sleeps in the cooler months, still hosts guests in the traditional way, because giving up that rhythm entirely never felt like progress to the people living it. It felt like a loss they weren't ready to accept. Food in Mauritania tells the same North meets South story as everything else. The national dish, tiboudien, arrived through Senegalese influence along the southern river valley. Rice and fish slow-cooked together in a rich tomato sauce, often with whatever vegetables are in season: cassava, carrots, eggplant. It's hearty, unpretentious, and everywhere, sold from street stalls and served at family tables with equal pride. Move north toward towns like Attar, closer to the Moorish cultural heartland, and the food shifts with the geography: couscous, made from wheat or millet, steamed and served under a stew of meat and vegetables, closer in spirit to Moroccan cooking than to anything from the coast. On special occasions in either region, there is mechoui, a whole lamb or goat slow roasted over an open flame until the meat falls from the bone, torn apart by hand and shared from a single communal platter. Because in Mauritania, eating alone from your own plate is almost beside the point of eating at all. Along the coast, near the Banque d'Arguin, a small community called the Imragouin still fish using methods that have barely changed in centuries, wading into shallow water with nets, sometimes working in an old, fading partnership with wild dolphins that once helped herd schools of mullet toward the shore. It's one of the last places on Earth where humans and wild dolphins cooperate this way, a fragile tradition that fewer families still practice each year, even as the fish they catch, dried, salted, turned into prized roe, still finds its way onto tables across the country. Even the daily rhythm of a Mauritanian household bends around faith and food together. Meals are eaten communally, usually from a single large shared platter, and almost always with the right hand, a practice tied closely to Islamic custom. Dates, grown in the palm groves of desert oases like Chenetti and Attar, are treated as more than just a snack. They're a small ceremonial gift, offered to guests alongside that first glass of tea, a taste of sweetness that the desert itself somehow still manages to produce. Markets in Nouakchott open early, before the worst of the heat arrives, filling with the smell of grilled meat, fresh mint, and diesel exhaust from the taxis weaving between stalls, while further out toward the edges of the city, informal neighborhoods continue to grow month by month as families arriving from the drought-stricken interior build new lives from breeze block and corrugated tin. An entirely different version of the same resilience playing out in the capital that plays out in Chenetti. This is roughly the halfway point of this journey through Mauritania, and if this is the kind of place you didn't expect to be fascinated by 20 minutes ago, that's usually the sign of a good subscribe button waiting nearby. It costs nothing, it takes 2 seconds, and it means the next overlooked country on Earth lands in front of you instead of getting lost in the algorithm. Now, back to the desert, and to the one idea that ties this entire country together. If there is a single concept that captures the Mauritanian character, it is woven directly into that tea ceremony. The belief that hospitality is not a nicety, it's an obligation, almost sacred in weight. Guests are treated with a warmth that can genuinely surprise outsiders, offered the best seat, the first glass, the most generous portion, often by families who have very little to spare. This isn't performative kindness for visitors. It's how Mauritanians treat each other constantly as a baseline expectation of what decent life looks like. Much of this culture traces back to the Bidhan, the Arab Berber population often called Moors, whose nomadic desert heritage shaped a code of conduct built around generosity, poetry, and honor. Values that made survival possible when the nearest neighbor might be a day's ride away, and might, one difficult season, be the only help you'd get. Hassaniya Arabic, the Bedouin dialect spoken by the majority of the population, still carries traces of that world in its vocabulary, rich in words for camels, sand, wind, and kinship, a language shaped by people who needed extremely precise words for an environment that offered no margin for vagueness. Islam sits at the absolute center of daily life here, not as a background detail, but as the organizing rhythm of the day itself. The call to prayer marks time the way a clock does elsewhere. Nearly the entire population is Muslim, and the faith shapes everything from the design of public life to greetings exchanged on the street, which almost always open with a blessing and a series of questions about your health, your family, and your peace. Questions that are answered fully and unhurriedly, because rushing through a greeting is its own kind of rudeness here. Poetry, too, holds a status that might surprise people from cultures where verse has become a niche interest. Traditional Hassani oral poetry, once recited under the tent by firelight, carried tribal history, moral guidance, and descriptions of the land itself from one generation to the next, long before much of it was ever written down. In a country with so few permanent structures across so much of its territory, poetry became one of the most durable things Mauritanians built, because words, unlike buildings, cannot be buried by sand. Ethnically and culturally, Mauritania is genuinely a meeting point, not a single story, but several woven together. Arab-Berber Bidhan communities form a large share of the population, historically dominant in political and economic life. Haratine communities, Arabic-speaking and descended from those historically enslaved by Bidhan families, make up another major share of the country. And in the south, along the Senegal River, communities of Halpular, Soninka, Wolof, and other West African ethnic groups bring their own languages, music, and traditions into the national mix, a reminder that Mauritania has never really been just Saharan or just West African. It's the hinge between both, and that hinge occasionally creaks. Political tensions between Arab-Berber and Black African Mauritanian communities have surfaced repeatedly across the country's modern history, over land, language policy, and political representation, and they remain part of the honest texture of national life, rather than a settled chapter of the past. Arabic is the sole official language, but French still lingers in government and education from the colonial era, while Pular, Soninka, and Wolof hold recognized status as national languages, spoken as a first language by millions of Mauritanians in the south. Walk through a single neighborhood in Nouakchott, and you can hear all of it within a single block. Hassania drifting from one doorway, Wolof from another, a radio somewhere playing French pop next to a call to prayer. Now, for the part of this story that matters just as much as the tea in the tents, because understanding a place honestly means looking at what makes daily life genuinely hard here, not just what makes it beautiful. Economically, Mauritania is a country of striking contrasts. Beneath its sand sit some of the richest mineral deposits in West Africa. Iron ore, gold, copper, and increasingly offshore natural gas, which began flowing into export markets in recent years and is starting to reshape the national budget. The country's Atlantic waters remain among the most productive fishing grounds on the planet, generating a significant share of export income. On paper, Mauritania has real resources. In practice, that wealth has been slow and uneven in reaching ordinary households. The World Bank has tracked meaningful recent progress, poverty rates declining and inflation cooling, but the average household budget still tells a much tighter story than the national accounts do. In Nouakchott, a typical monthly income sits somewhere in the low hundreds of dollars, and for many families that income barely stretches across even a modest month of rent, food, and transport. Renting a small unfurnished apartment in the capital might run somewhere between $100 and $400 a month depending on the neighborhood, while a basic family food budget, built mostly around local staples like rice, dates, bread, and vegetables, can still consume a significant share of what a household brings in. Public transport is inexpensive by global standards, but wages for most Mauritanians outside skilled or foreign-linked sectors have simply not kept pace with the cost of city life. It's a place where the numbers are genuinely low compared to wealthy nations, but so is the ceiling on what most people can earn. And that gap is the quiet, daily arithmetic behind almost every household decision here. There are heavier truths too, and an honest account of this country cannot look away from them. Mauritania holds the difficult distinction of being the last country in the world to formally abolish slavery through a presidential decree in 1981. That decree alone did not end the practice in reality, since it created no criminal penalty. And it took until 2007 for a law to actually criminalize owning another person, followed by a stronger law in 2015 that classified slavery as a crime against humanity. Human rights organizations and Mauritanian activists continue to report that hereditary forms of servitude persist in parts of the country, particularly affecting Haratine communities, and that enforcement of the law remains inconsistent. It is a painful thread running through the country's social fabric, tied closely to old caste structures between Bidhan and Haratine communities, and it exists alongside real ongoing activism from Mauritanians themselves, abolitionist organizations founded by local advocates who have pushed, often at real personal risk, for the laws on paper to become the reality on the ground. Progress has been slow and incomplete, but it has not stopped, and understanding modern Mauritania means understanding both the persistence of this problem and the persistence of the people working against it. The desert itself remains an active daily threat too, not an abstract climate statistic, but something you can watch happen to a home. Only a small fraction of Mauritania's land, well under 1%, is considered farmable, and that fraction keeps shrinking as drought conditions and shifting sand encroach further each year. Chenetti is only the most visible casualty. Herding families that once moved freely with the seasons increasingly find pasture disappearing beneath them, pushing more people towards cities that are themselves struggling to keep up with the pace of that migration, stretching water access, housing, and services in Nouakchot's rapidly expanding outer districts. Mauritania sits within one of the parts of the world most affected by a changing climate, despite contributing almost nothing to the emissions driving it. And among African nations, only a couple have recorded more measurable climate impacts. Add to this a region that has, at times, dealt with political instability, including a history of military transitions and coups since independence, and you have a country where daily life requires a kind of resilience that is easy to romanticize from a distance, and much harder to actually live through up close. And yet, none of this cancels out what makes Mauritania remarkable. It sits alongside it. People here are not living in spite of hardship in some simplistic, inspirational poster way. They are living inside it with clear eyes, deep humor, fierce family bonds, and a hospitality that somehow gets more generous, not less, when resources are tight. That contradiction is, in many ways, the truest thing about this country. So, could you actually live here? Probably not without real adjustment. The heat is unrelenting for much of the year. Infrastructure outside the capital and a handful of towns is thin. Career opportunities in most sectors remain limited unless you're bringing specialized skills the local economy needs. Comfort, in the way many of us define it, would require some serious recalibration. But comfort was never really the question worth asking about a place like this. The real question is whether you could learn to sit still for 3 small glasses of tea, in silence sometimes, in conversation others, and let that be enough for an hour of your day. Whether you could measure wealth not by what's in your bank account, but by how many people would show up unasked if your roof ever needed rebuilding or your family ever needed feeding. Whether you could watch the sand slowly take a neighbor's house and choose, like so many in Chenetti do, to stay anyway. Because some things, a language, a manuscript, a way of greeting a stranger, are worth defending even against the desert itself. Mauritania will likely never top anyone's list of easy places to live. It asks a great deal of the people who call it home, and it gives back in ways that don't always show up on a spreadsheet, but that seem to matter just as much to the people who've never known anything else. Maybe that's the real lesson sitting underneath all that sand. Somewhere between the Sahara and the Atlantic, in a country most of the world has never had a reason to think about, millions of people have built entire lives, entire histories, entire identities out of very little water and a great deal of will. And every single day, in courtyards and tents and living rooms across the country, someone pours a stranger their first glass of tea, bitter as life, and waits to see what they'll make of the two that follow. If a place like that has earned a few more minutes of your curiosity, it's earned a subscribe too, because there is a whole world of countries like this one still waiting to be understood properly, and this channel is where that happens next. Until then, from a slowly vanishing city in the middle of the Sahara, thank you for watching.